I do know that athletes are taught to finish strong, and we're going to finish strong this morning. 3 great panels on the future of transportation, tech censorship, and energy issues. And so I know you're going to enjoy this morning's sessions. Discovery for some time has been involved in the future of transportation. For many years, actually, almost 30 years in transportation policy, but more recently, our ACES Northwest Network has been a regional leader in advancing the future of autonomous, connected electric and shared vehicles in the region. And a part of that team is Scott Kuznicki, and he's going to come up and introduce this panel.
Now we'll have technology that works. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here for the 3rd day of the COSM Technology Summit. And we've been addressing generative AI, which of course you might think is what happens when computers go wrong. A colleague of mine said that his full self-driving equipment on his Tesla was able to drive him here this morning, and I think that's absolutely impressive. And we've seen a lot of advancements in vehicle autonomy. But what we at the Discovery Institute are looking to do is to promote a culture of purpose, creativity, and innovation. And creativity needs to be unbridled, and creativity requires us to do something that Dr. Marks said on Wednesday, which is to connect. The transportation system helps us connect. And in the past 3.5 years, we've seen that connection really involves actually being there in person. It means shaking someone's hand. It means sitting down for a cup of coffee and looking someone directly in the eyes instead of looking at a camera so they can see your eyes. Connection is what transportation is all about, and connection is best protected when we protect the liberty of mobility. The liberty of mobility is extremely important. You need to be free to choose when you travel, where you travel, and how you travel, because you alone understand how you can maximize the value of your access to the transportation system. So we see that the implications of AI are perhaps pressing. So I prepared a description of this panel, and I'll read it to you. I'll share it with you. It's a little early for something so provocative, but I'm sure you'll indulge me. The implications of an AI-driven future in transportation are equal parts compelling, convoluted, and chilling. Today's machine learning systems are ingesting information concerning human movement, assessing behavior, rating choices and patterns, and assessing the outcomes of billions of individual paths, whether they exist or not. Managing the transportation system is already seen as a means of mitigating climate change and quelling undesirable patterns of social interaction. Will liberty of mobility be protected in the vehicle logistics and infrastructure industries, where the insights gleaned from data can be used to help individuals reduce cost and optimize efficiency? Or will constant connectivity and ubiquitous scrutiny create a soul-crushing hellscape of total control, where unelected technocrats reign and a conventional bicycle is the only way out? Let's welcome our panel to the stage and Brian Mistley to talk about the future of transportation and the implications of AI. Brian and the panel, welcome.
Well, so good morning. We've heard in this conference how AI is going to extend lifespans. We've heard about how AI is going to change material science and make our lives for the better from the Ray Kurzweil presentation. So today we get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is AI in transportation. And if you think about transportation, we've got some huge societal problems. We've got 5 billion hours just in the United States each year wasted in traffic congestion. We've got 1 billion gallons of gas that are wasted, just people stuck in traffic, not total usage. That's just what can be saved if we help reduce overall congestion. But the biggest issue for me is 1.4 billion deaths, 1.4 million deaths around the world due to traffic fatalities. So these are huge societal issues. I'm so excited to have 3 great panelists today. Rich Popel from General Motors, who leads their AI and ML lab. Dorothy Lee from CTO of Convoy until last week, and I'll let her explain that. then Mark Vasong from Urban Logic. But since my attempt to have ChatGPT introduce my speaker on Wednesday didn't go exactly according to plan, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves and their role in the transportation sector.
Thank you, Brian. So, Rich Popel. I am the Executive Director of the Integration and AI/ML Center at General Motors. And one of the things that I found very interesting this week, well, outside of graphene, was that people, when I introduced myself, I got a lot of questions on, well, what is GM doing in AI? And we've been doing actually quite a bit for quite a while. About 7 years ago, the then CIO, Randy Mott, sent sort of a cryptic email to me saying, what do you know about AI/ML? And I said, well, I know a little. And so that was the birth of our AI/ML Center. We started with 1 employee, and then 2, and then 10. And we now have about 300 practitioners. Almost half of them are scientists that are building production algorithms. And we'll talk in some detail about the kinds of things that we're doing.
Well, thanks, Rich, and thanks, Brian. Great to be here. I'm really glad this is an AI conference because many of you may have heard that Convoy had to shut its doors about 2 weeks ago. And so the AI was probably trained prior to October and didn't know about this, so I got to sneak in still. As the CEO of Convoy. But for those of you that don't know, Convoy was built in 2015 with the goal of reducing waste in the transportation, particularly the full truckload space. And the core of it is a digital marketplace that connects a long tail of small trucking companies. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of trucking companies, millions of truck drivers. And we use ML and AI to connect them to build this marketplace and also automate a lot of the workflow that has a lot of waste today in the trucking company. But prior to Convoy, I spent over 23 years at one of the other employers in this region called Amazon. The last 8 years at Amazon, I focused on data and analytics and AI at AWS. Before I left, we actually launched one of the first cloud-native natural language query-empowered data analytics solutions. So I'm really glad to be here and really glad to be having spent some time in the transportation, really glad to see and to see how ML and AI is really starting to make a difference in the waste and the inefficiencies in this industry.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Song from Urban Logic. So Urban Logic is a data platform that harnesses the compounding value of data for governments. So a common theme at this conference has been, are we running out of data? I'll tell you right now, there's a huge, enormous treasure trove of untapped data in government data silos. So what we do is we build data pipelines from federal, state, county, local governments across all departments: transportation, economic development, urban planning, public safety, and social services. And we fuse that into one common operating picture of all community behavior. From that, then you can learn a lot of insights about the interrelated relationship of different modalities, including transportation. So, for example, we'll map out how people won't drive more than 10 minutes to go to a Chick-fil-A, but might drive 40 minutes to go to a high-end sushi restaurant. So we build out a mobility fingerprint of every business, every neighborhood, et cetera. And that allows them to plan, as they plan kind of land use and longer-term plans, they can then model out what transportation infrastructure will be impacted. Or the vice versa, like this is the other part where transportation can actually feed other departments. So some things that we'll do is we'll identify where certain neighborhoods are driving, disproportionately long distances in order to access everything from community services to grocery stores. And then that information can be turned over to local businesses where if you want to build a successful next store, here would be a really good tip of where you can build that. And so there's a lot of AI, both actually in the analysis of those insights, but I think something that we can get into is most of our AI work is actually in how to automate the data ingestion of unstructured, hidden dark data, which I think is really where I think it's not properly appreciated, the huge opportunity in that space.
So for years, there was an enormous amount of investment and excitement in autonomous vehicles, robotaxis, automated trucking, and a variety of other things that we refer to as the ACEs as part of Discovery Institute: autonomous, connected, electric, and shared vehicles. But it seems like a lot of these trends have stalled or slowed down. So what I'd love to ask each of the panelists is your view on the state of the industry. And Rich, having being at a car maker, love your feedback. Please spend a couple minutes. What do you think is the state of the autonomous vehicle market and overall the future of mobility?
It's an interesting question because I wouldn't say that things have slowed down in terms of the degree of investment, although there are certain players that are in and then out. I would say that it's a lot harder problem to solve than I think people thought it was originally. I would say that the challenge with thinking about automated driving is that you're in a situation where you're dealing with the kinds of interactions with objects that traditional machine learning kinds of activities don't necessarily lend themselves well to, right? So you can understand the behavior of a vehicle, but you're actually also having to try and understand the behavior of all of the different objects that are in the world around you as well. So there are different schools of thought in terms of how to think about that. So we heard about the Tesla full self-driving this morning, and I'm fine if people are driving a Tesla. It's okay. The school of thought at Tesla is that it's largely oriented around using stereoscopic vision to detect the world around it, and in the process of detecting the world around it in the same way that we do, looking for markers of how to behave and how to control. So these are lane lines, this is a stop sign, I'm approaching an intersection and there is a stop sign. The way that we've taken the approach, particularly for full self-driving and robo-taxis and things of that nature, as well as automated driving in retail vehicles, is that we want to limit the amount of work that's being done on the vehicle in terms of trying to perceive the world around them. So what we do is we actually create a reference model of the world. We call it a high-definition map. It's 5-centimeter precision, and it says exactly, here are lane lines, and this is where you need to be in the lane. This is an intersection that you're approaching, and this intersection is controlled by a stop sign. And in the case of maybe some 18-year-old driving through the stop sign and over the stop sign and taking out the stop sign, I still know that that's a 4-way stop at the end of my street. And I'm not saying that because my 18-year-old drove over the stop sign at the end of my street. But I think that those are important distinctions, and that's part of the evolution, because as you start getting into, okay, how do I in fact create, if I'm using the Tesla model, how do I create the ability to recognize every possible combination of things that happen in the world? That's an enormous amount of data, an enormous amount of scenarios that need to be planned and understood. In our case, it means that we actually have to build specialized AI kinds of tools that exist outside of the vehicle that we can be pushing into it, these high-definition maps. And that's a real challenge in the first place. So Super Cruise is full hands-free driving. If anybody has driven a Super Cruise vehicle, it's pretty cool. It's on motorways, primary roads, and trunk roads. It's 500,000 miles worth of roadway in the US. And basically the way we got the high-definition maps for that was we ran cars with LiDAR up and down these streets and did all the pixelation and stitched it together in the back and created a map and said, this is a lane, this is a dotted line, this is a solid line. These are all the things that you should be referencing. When we start talking about being able to go door to door, being able to create that kind of reference map with that kind of precision is incredibly challenging. There are 3.2 million miles of roadway in the US. Nobody has the ability to go out and drive up and down these roads and gather the information. And by the time you've got it, it's probably changed anyway. So the way that we've done it is we take the data that we get, the motility data that we get from the vehicles, and we can understand then, this is a 2-lane road, this is a 4-lane road, this is an intersection. At this intersection, there is a stop sign because we can see how cars move through it. There's an unprotected left turn here. And we can take all of that and marry that up with aerial photography, aerial images, and actually create these high-definition maps of all of the things that we need to exist in nature. But that kind of work is incredibly difficult to do, and it takes a lot of invention along the way. And I think what we're seeing in slowdown is a function of the degree of invention that needs to go on in order to make this work.
Great. Dorothy, Mark, thoughts on state of the industry?
Well, Well, I think if you just look at the kind of the AI, the evolution of AI, like at the height of, or any adoption of major technology, at the height of a hype cycle, we as humans tend to underestimate the degree of complexity in reality, and so we have to feel we have a lot of optimism for adoption and for what the technology can do. Doesn't mean the technology isn't going to solve these problems in the long run, but I think that reality is particularly complex when it comes to transportation, right? And we all know that there are so many exceptions, especially in trucking. What happens if a trailer breaks down? What happens if the truck route isn't what the passenger route is? You can't rely on Google Map. And trucking particularly is full of exceptions. In fact, I would say 90% of the time we're dealing with exceptions and not the sort of the happy path. But what makes me tremendously hopeful about this next generation of AI, what we call generative AI, is that unlike the traditional ML, which is sort of more declarative or imperative, where you say, hey, I want to go from Seattle to LA, what are the routes? And it sort of spits out an algorithm. But what happens with all of the different exceptions that you see, difference is a generative AI will say, well, look, if there is a traffic congestion, then maybe let me choose a different route. Or if there is, my trailer breaks down, let me generate a different way of doing these. So I think this next wave of AI because it's trained on, in a way has some certain amount of common sense. The way it's trained and the way it's developed, that it's actually able to adapt, or maybe a better way that it's a more adaptive kind of an AI. And I think it's particularly suited to handle exceptions in the transportation industry. So I'm very optimistic about this next generation of generative AI being applied to solve the complicated physical world that we're in. Now, that said, I think lots of human judgment in the mix and figuring out where humans should be in the loop when we use ML and AI, when a complete automated solution is there, and when we plug in human is a journey I think we're still on.
So one of the cool things working with governments is we're stuck with a different problem. So I think there can be debate whether self-driving cars would be, fully functional in 5-10 years. I don't think there's a lot of question, at least in the minds of government, that it'll be functional in 20 years. And 20 years tends to be the ability or the design year that cities have to plan 20 years ahead when they're planning infrastructure. So the governments we're working with are assuming self-driving cars are going to be fully operational by the time that the decisions they're making today are happening. And so whether it be Oahu or Orange County, our fun work is trying to model out what would happen in a world where self-driving cars are adopted at different percentages. So we went to, there's a town in northern Norway called Kongsberg. And it's I think General Motors actually does some stuff there, but it's a town that allows their roads to be used as a living test bed for self-driving cars. So kids are walking across the streets while self-driving cars are driving past. And one of the things that we're trying to look at is, if you don't have to park the car at your work, like it can drop you off at work and then drive itself back home, then one of the things that we're looking at is, does this change the nature of urban planning with parking? So there are 8 parking spots for every car because you don't know if your car is going to be here at home or at the shopping mall, so city planners have to build extra car parking spots. 45% of San Bernardino's downtown land is parking. So you have this weird world where we have a shortage of housing space, but we have an overabundance in theory of parking if self-driving cars happen. So I think that's the world we're looking at, where how will this change the nature of our community behavior? That's at least how we're looking at it, is our role right now is assuming it happens. How does that change the fabric of community infrastructure?
So what are the key use cases that get you all most excited? I mean, obviously there's steering a car, but are there other use cases that you sort of look 5-10 years in the future that get you excited, whether it's AI, machine learning, or deep learning? And maybe someone can talk about the differences in those. Go ahead.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm super excited about what generative AI can do in our industry, and especially, actually right before about a month ago, some of our engineers were starting to take all of our data and just build using OpenAI and Anthropic and build a chatbot to start asking about information about the shipment, information about what the driver should be doing. And it was literally put together in about a week. And so the amount of the speed at which you can go from an idea to be able to test it out, and then also for the ability for a human to be able to consult an AI like that. I'm excited about the collaboration between human and AI. And a lot of people, we hear a lot about whether AI is gonna, where it's gonna take over. It's gonna, it's almost like we're in the utopian world. But I'm very optimistic about this increased collaboration between AI and human. I think we're just going to make a lot of the folks that are doing unglamorous, tedious work in this industry to be a lot more productive.
I'll go. I didn't want to go first every time because I'm to the right of Brian. I think one of the most interesting things is what Mark was describing in terms of how you think about vehicles. Not just vehicle, right? We're all very sort of self-aware of the container that we're in, but our ability to start, particularly with the connective technology that we have today, our ability to start creating digital twins at the edge and being able to do things that represent improvements in safety and efficiency at the population level that then have impacts at the very specific level, I think that's really incredibly exciting. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. One of the things that is, we're very passionate about safety at General Motors. We start every meeting with a safety message. Safety is a very important thing for us. The idea of being able to help people safely navigate from one place to another is the kind of problem that hasn't been solved really before. So if you imagine a world of connected vehicles, and we have digital twins at the edge of each of those vehicles, for those of you from the Northeast or the Midwest, you know about black ice, you know about signs that say bridge freezes before road surface. And in fact, oftentimes the bridge really does freeze before the road surface. And our ability to be looking at data from the population and be able to say, in deteriorating weather conditions, I can identify anti-lock braking, I can identify full lock braking, I can identify traction slip, I can start seeing where degrading road surfaces are, and I can be dynamically impacting, the safe travel of everyone in that community by routing them to areas where the road conditions are good. I mean, that's one example, being able to optimize routes through the entirety of a network as opposed to one vehicle at a time. This notion of being able to think about vehicles and the experience of vehicles versus vehicle, I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, just real quick on that, because I think, where we're talking about in this, you mentioned the fleet of vehicles. I think in the industry, especially in the transportation industry, we've never really been able to achieve economy of scale. You're looking at always one car, one truck, and if you can have that totality, and that is a much more efficient, you think about everything in a sort of universal pool, it's a much more efficient way of coordinating and reducing waste.
Yeah, building on the idea of totality, actually. So I think what's exciting for us is there's enough data out there to be making smart decisions in government. They just never had the capacity to consider all the different factors that we know come into play. Machine and deep learning opens that up. So, for example, in San Jose, we built them something called a decision support system. And so what it does is it allows them to model the impact of, I think, 40 different key performance indicators on equity, economic sustainability, and environmental protection based on any different policy decision around land or infrastructure building. And so, for example, one of the things they originally said was one of our goals is to reduce single occupancy vehicle use by 50%. Okay, you can do that, and you model where people live and go to work. So if you optimize transit routes around that, One of the things that they noticed, though, that the system detected is that'll drive up housing prices here and just nail you on your goals of having more equitable housing prices. So what AI allows you to do is look at a basket of different indicators and kind of toggle all the different features to figure out the optimal balance of, having the most efficient transit system may not actually be more important to you than improving safety and improving equitable, social conditions, et cetera. So that has always been, there's always been enough data for that. If you look at the totality of government data, they've always had enough data to do that. They just never had the compute power and the models to do that. And that's actually now not just the theory, these are things that are happening today, and it is actually really exciting to see that happen in a day-to-day function at a city staffer.
So let's talk about some of the challenges. Is AI and developing AI for autonomous vehicles, the transportation sector, different than an enterprise using ChatGPT and how they integrate that into their websites?
Yes. It's much different. I think it comes down to a couple of things. First of all, the automotive industry, I didn't realize this before I joined GM, is the most heavily regulated industry in this country. It's astounding the amount of regulation that's involved. And so when you think about that in the context of new product development and new capability development, there's an awful lot of complexity that just from a regulatory perspective we need to take into account. But I think the bigger factors at play here are the things that are really oriented around, if I get an erroneous answer from ChatGPT, the impact of an erroneous answer is not the same as an impact from an erroneous model that's in an autonomous vehicle. So the degree of safety that needs to go into the considerations is extremely high. The other thing I'll say is that, road systems really are designed by traffic engineers, right? I mean, these are people that are taking the long view that Mark was talking about. So we need to be thinking about things in the context not just of, what is the business model or what is the operating parameter that we need to take into account. It's really in the context of how city planners and how traffic engineers think about transportation and think about the movement inside their cities. And I think the last thing I would say is, there's a lot of regional variation that we need to take into account, particularly on self-driving vehicles. I grew up in Pittsburgh. There's a thing called a Pittsburgh left. It's only in Pittsburgh, apparently. And it's that if you're at a traffic light and it's an unprotected left turn, the first car in line gets to make the left turn. If I'm in an autonomous vehicle that doesn't understand that and the light turns green, I'm going to be the AV that's going to go, oh, I'm going to nail that sucker. And I think it's that kind of distinction. There's a Michigan left, which is different than a Pittsburgh left. The variations that happen from region to region to region and the way you need to incorporate that into something that is a national product adds a great deal of complexity to it.
That's so true, and that's I lived through this with trucking for sure. I mean, there's the Florida Panhandle, and people think that's actually very different from just a few miles away. You could have a very different profile of whether how easy it is to get out than if going to somewhere else outside the Panhandle, but. One of the key challenges, I think, in transportation, and at least the world that I was in trucking, was also data. And when we think about AI and ML, data is really at the core of it. ML and AI is trained on data. And in trucking, for example, we have a sparse of data. And you think about it's hard enough to get every truck driver to use a mobile phone to get data, and let alone just to make sure that every trailer has IoT sensors. And so I think not having the kind of the right and the amount of data has been an impediment so far. But again, going back to the generative AI capabilities, what I'm particularly excited about is that capability to be able to connecting the dots, even when data is sparse, to be able to get the embeddings from these particular characteristics or particular areas or regions and see if that applies to other regions that may not have seen. Now, that we've not yet seen that deploy at scale, but that gives me some hope in the area where, in the industry where I think data is hard to come by.
Mark, would you mind if I built on the data?
That's our goal, actually. So, I mean, our goal is to access all this government data and then make it accessible to everyone else who could have used it. So, one of the things, for example, that we refer to as road segment persona. So, we actually met with your cruise team in San Francisco back in, I think, 2017. And one of the things they pointed out is a driver is more than your senses. Like, you might be driving down a road and you subconsciously slow down. I'm Canadian, so I'll say kilometers, 30 kilometers an hour, even though the speed limit is 50, because you just know, back in your mind, that annoying kid always runs across the street chasing that ball, so you just subconsciously slow down. And so in a lot of the cases, like, we see a lot of this data, whether it be from computer vision cameras from Mile Vision or from the company formerly known as Wejo. So we have a lot of these data sources. So when we were working with cities to help them timing traffic lights, we had to model road segment by road segment how people behave at certain times of day. That data, I would imagine, be enormously useful for OEMs. And so these are the sorts of things where our goal is to make that data available, because the government paid for it. It should be made available to the public. This will probably, I imagine, get into further the conversation. It's just, what are the rules around that? That's where we're basically, I think the government is a little bit not mature in their data governance and compliance structures.
Well, the data aspect is a really interesting one, because I think it was Bob said yesterday, quoting Wolfram, that, you know, we're on the leading edge of data, and, you know, we've consumed all the data that there is to consume. And that may be true for large language models, but that is not true in the autonomous driving space. And, you know, I think your point around the sort of the dearth of data, you know, when it comes to training models and training algorithms, being able to have the kind of data that goes into perception vehicles it's hard to find. We have 24 vehicles that basically run round the clock with cameras on them in various regions of the country that are just getting training data that we then have to take apart and try and parse it. And one of the things that I've been very excited about in the last year or so has been being able to create synthetic data, right? And being able to use that synthetic data. So if you're trying to distinguish between, like, a bicycle that's between two cars at a stop sign or at a stoplight, and a bicycle that it's attached to the car in front of you. Like, there's not a lot of that training data out there that you can go get and train, you know, hundreds of thousands of times. It's not like dog, 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 dog kind of thing, right? But the idea then of being able to create synthetic data, so stitching images together from a variety of images to create the new kind of training scenarios that you need, has been very exciting. But then I started thinking about it in the context of the model collapse discussion that we had yesterday, and I still have the image of the Mona Lisa turning into a Rorschach etched in my head. And I really need to think about that, because being able to maintain the integrity of the training data is going to be absolutely critically important. So it's kind of given me that was one of my big learnings yesterday.
Well, so that brings up a good topic, and that is, in the industry, there's this big debate between learned behavior and reference models. Tesla sort of does the former, and a few others, and a variety of the car makers do the latter. And I'll make the analogy to AlphaGo. If any of you know the story of AlphaGo, very hard to create a program, and they originally started to create programs looking at everybody who's ever played AlphaGo and sort of learned behavior based on existing players, and it was very hard for the computer to beat and win and go. Then they decided, don't give it any data, let it learn on its own by playing itself, and it eventually became much, much smarter than just looking at what humans did. So learned behavior versus reference models in the autonomous vehicle world, do we just rely on sensor data and learning and self-learning, or do we build these reference models that as Rich said, HD maps, mapping every stop sign, every street light, centimeter level accuracy, and that's how these vehicles navigate? Which is better? Are there pros and cons?
Well, obviously, I think the reference model is better, because that's the model that we're using. At dinner the other night, Walter said to me, hey, how come my BMW tried to back into the gate at the end of the driveway the other day? And I said, I don't know, your sensor? And he's like, oh, yeah, I got a sensor warning light on it the other day. I'm like, there you go. Sensors are fragile, right? So relying, particularly in an autonomous vehicle, relying on sensors as the full stop system, it introduces an element of risk, right? And which is why having a reference model is really, really valuable, because If you know where you are in space, you know what you should be anticipating in space, and you know what you should be looking for. And if you're not seeing it, it's either because it's not there, like the stop sign my kid hit, or it's the sensor calibration isn't right and you need to be thinking about it. And so I think from an ongoing, in terms of which is going to be easier to actually develop a final product, we're still in competition. We'll know in a couple of years when somebody declares victory. In terms of sustainability, I absolutely think a reference model is critical.
The only thing I'd add is that on a lot of there's the other aspect of vehicle to infrastructure sensors, and so I think there's a big debate between 5G and I guess, yeah, so it's 5G now because DSRC is not happening. But so I think that's the other aspect is a lot of governments, as they wire out 5G across their networks, can the city talk to cars? I know like we've seen pilots where if there's like a blind spot and a car's coming around the corner, the city infrastructure can warn a car backing out that, you know, it'll activate, like, here's the thing, like, there's a whole bunch of, this is your world, but like in theory, the city could override your car and press your brakes because you can't see a car's about to collide with you because you're backing into a blind spot. So I think there's lots of rich opportunity. The technology's there. I think it's just people need to work out governance and deployment because you can't really have that if only some cars have it. So I think there's the technical solutions are there.
So let's talk about data privacy. These autonomous vehicles just generate an enormous amount of data that are used to obviously enhance the models and improve the overall systems. But they also obviously know where you drive. They know when you drive. They know when you make a Philadelphia left, or in Boston, the first 3 or 4 cars would
Pittsburgh
be a Boston left. Pittsburgh left, sorry. They know when you speed. There's a bunch of other things that are issues in terms of data privacy, and governments are kind of grappling with these issues. So what are your all thoughts on data privacy and how we protect data privacy, but at the same time use data to improve models and improve the overall system?
So I'll start with that one because that's a big thing with us is because I think the key thing is there just has to be clear rules. And what generally, like, there's a joke about standards, like everyone has one, but no one, they're like toothbrushes, everyone has one, but no one wants to share. And so one of the things that I think you can see is where certain governments are ahead of things and what that indicates how privacy, at least in the transportation space, might be different than a lot of other privacy discussions. So the strictest privacy rules generally are the Europeans, GDPR. And if you actually look very closely, I think it's Article 84, they say all these privacy rules apply to OEMs, cell phone makers, et cetera. But governments will be exempt if we want to use it for smart city planning. So they actually made themselves exempt from their own privacy rules. And I think they did that because there's a public good clause. They said if you can demonstrate that there's a public good coming out of this privacy data, then as long as the right protections are in place and everything around cybersecurity and controls, et cetera, then we will allow these data sources to be used. So I actually do think that precedent has been set, and it's just going to be a matter now of different governments. Like California came out with the CCPA. If you read it, how different is it from GDPR? So I think most governments are basically adopting the same types of standards. I think in the transportation space, it'll be a lot of noise, but I think as long as there's clear definitions of why it's being used, people will be common sense about it.
I think that's right. I also think that, you know, from our perspective, we take data privacy very, very seriously. We were a first mover in connected vehicles, so we've had OnStar connected vehicles for more than 20 years, right? That's well more than anybody else has. And so when we think about the privacy aspect of it, GPS data is sensitive customer private information. In the same way that, you know, your address and your credit card and things like that are. So we're very, very careful about it. When we look at the data, if it's exposing, and this is for our internal consumption, so the 300 or so people that are sort of looking at this stuff, if it's for internal consumption, the only way we are using customer-specific data is if it's in the context of a service to a customer that a customer has signed up for. So we do smart driving programs that will use the data from the vehicle to teach people how to drive better. A lot of parents with 16, 17, 18-year-old kids are very interested in being able to get that. Well, that kind of data we only use and we only expose explicitly in the service of a customer and with the customer's consent. When it comes to looking at motility data, we strip VINs out, as you know, we blur endpoints. We take very strong caution and cryptographically secure anything that might be able to link that back to an individual customer. So we're very serious about it because there's no better way to lose trust with your customers than if you don't be a good steward with their data. So that's something that is critically important to us.
So how do you think about the human-AI interaction? Right now, as most folks know, if you've driven a Tesla Copilot or one of the other systems, you have to basically have your hand on the wheel. You have to be kind of attentive. Are there limits to, kind of the future in the AI-human interaction? Is there a day where I can just sit in the back seat and read a book while my car just completely navigates through snow, through rain, and through other conditions?
Well, if you drive a Super Cruise vehicle, you don't have to have your hands on the wheel, by the way. So I just want to shamelessly plug that. I talked to my wife the other day, and she's like, I'm eating a sandwich. I'm on my way home eating a sandwich. I'm like, how great for you. I do think that it's a natural evolution. I think the issue here really is one that's more of acceptance and the challenge of consumer acceptance of these kinds of things. And I think the keys to acceptance really come down to probably three different things. The first is you really need to be transparent, right? One of the things that we do in the cruise vehicles is we have a screen that shows to the passengers everything that the vehicle is seeing, so that they can look at the world around them and they can look at the screen and they can say, the car is processing the world around me in the same way that I am, right? That's a reassuring mechanism, right? So being able to create that kind of transparency. We do it with Super Cruise, right? I'm going to be changing a lane, so we signal the driver, I'm about to initiate a lane change. I'm looking for an opening. I'm making the change. I think the other thing that we need to do in terms of that acceptance is we have to hold our performance standards well higher than a human operator. I mean, I don't know if you guys have been out there recently, but people are terrible drivers, right? So just saying, well, I can drive as well as a human isn't good enough. It's got to be materially better, right? Because the bar is so low for the average driver. And that's not just like safety records and things of that nature. It's really about the overall performance and the overall experience, right? It's, the braking has to be smooth. The lane control has to be smooth. The acceleration has to be smooth. Everything about it has to feel like it's better than human performance in order to be able to get that. And I think the last thing is it really needs to be evolutionary, right? So you start with something where your hands are on the wheel, like Tesla, and then you move to something where your hands are off the wheel, like General Motors. And then you move to door, and then, because once people get comfortable with, yes, it's working well on the highway, then you start saying driving through urban and rural settings. Okay, I'm good with this. And then you take all of the driver controls out, and people start feeling naturally good about it. So I think it's that evolutionary step that's sort of the third critical piece to acceptance.
I had actually a couple of friends that took a autonomous cruise driving car in San Francisco, I think, before they took that away, and they were really surprised how relaxed they could be. So I think the technology will be there, and I think the technology will not be, the capabilities will be there, and the real issue is, we were talking outside earlier about, if you have, what was the example that you used? If you have a woman jumping,
the trolley
problem.
Right. Which, for those of you who don't know, is classic in the AV space, which is if a car gets in a situation where it decides it either has to run over the old lady in front of you or crash into a post and kill the driver, how does it make that ethical decision?
Right. I think if you ask two different humans, they may ask two different, make two different judgments as well. And so who's to say who's right? And the AI also may make a different decision. So I think it's more of feels like our laws and regulations have to keep up with the changing technology. And if history is event telling, it will always be lagging. So we've need to start thinking about how we start to regulate and what's acceptable in that world that I think will come.
So let's talk a little bit more about regulation. So I've spent way too much time in Washington, D.C. in my life on different policy things. And the one thing I've learned is, government loves regulation. They love to regulate things. But at the same time, what I see over and over again is there's different lobbies of constituents, whether it's the taxi drivers, whether it's bus drivers and things like that, that always have kind of vested interest in kind of keeping innovation from happening. So is there a role for regulation? What is that role? How do you think of that?
I mean,
are looking at Marcus here.
Yeah.
so I think there will have to be regulation because if for no other reason, I imagine General Motors and certainly a startup like us, like we will not invest in something unless we know, like, can we still sell this in 2 years? That's actually been one of our bigger problems is a lot of things we know can be done. We don't know if it's going to be allowed to be done. I had to explain that to investors. We discovered this thing and they said, why aren't you selling it? Because I don't think this should be legal. That's a real thing. And so I think that's the first thing is governments are going to need to regulate things in order for industry. It's kind of a, industry oftentimes has to do things for governments to be forced to regulate it, but industry sometimes won't move unless we know like some certainty. So I think regulation will have to be a key role there. And I think part of the challenge is it's one of education. Like governments have to. So Brian was mentioning you spend a lot of time in DC, and a lot of our time actually is having to go even to like local council. This should by the way be a national and international decision, but a lot of local governments are coming up with their own rules around what types of self-driving and data science is allowed in their cities. There's a town of less than 100,000 people in Canada where, I'll never forget it, July 27th, they had to change their local bylaws to allow some of our products in the market because they had to specify what is and isn't allowed. So if every small town has to come up with their own rules, that's not going to work. So I think this is something where the industry has to come together and almost collaborate to force governments to come to the table.
Yeah, and I really agree with that. I mean, the regional distinctions aren't just around driving behavior. There are regional distinctions around different rules and regulations that pertain to it. And it's not like, it's not like that's pervasive across transportation, right? I mean, like nobody decides that they're going to create upside down triangular stop signs and say, well, these are what all of our stop signs are going to look like, right? We have federal regulations that are describing things that are intended to be, ubiquitous across the country. And I think a lot of the sort of the pockets of irregularity amongst regulation needs to be addressed at a state and local level in order to be able to enable us to actually sell and operate product across the country without having to deal with that kind of regulatory complexity. I think the other thing is that I think that in some ways people underestimate what can be done and overestimate what can be done. And the problem with the regulatory environment is that they tend to be oriented towards one or the other of those swings. So I think there really is a very big education role here with regulators to understand the technology. It goes back to that sense of transparency around acceptance, right? It's an acceptance at a regulatory level as well, right? You need to be able to be very transparent about what it is. You need to be able to have your performance bar set very high, and you need to be able to show something that feels very evolutionary in the way that you're progressing things in order to be able to bring the regulatory environment along with you.
So let's talk a little bit about urban planning. Let me paint two pictures of the future. Picture one, we've got all these connected AVs, and cities can optimize the overall transportation networks. They can reduce congestion, keep traffic flowing, and eliminate bottlenecks and everything else. Other scenario, cities basically can control where you drive, when you drive. They charge you by the mile. VMT tax is a real thing. So which vision of the future are we headed towards, and how do we avoid the pitfalls?
Just by describing this, I obviously would prefer the first. And I hear there are cities in China that are doing something like that, where they're planning the city and where and the city is equipped. Even the lanes have these sensors that the vehicles can guide vehicles. So that sounds pretty good to me. I'm sure you have thoughts, Rich.
Well, sure. So first of all, I would prefer the former as well. I don't know that it's going to be necessarily done at a city-by-city level. I think that there are going to be multiple players, and I think we really need to be in a position where we have something that feels like it's sort of an open community, very much like an open source kind of community, in order to be able to allow various players to participate, right, at the state and the local level. There's a company in Michigan called Cavenue that basically builds autonomous roadways, and their sort of secret formula is that they've got signage, digital signage all along the roadways that are providing instruction then back to each of the different vehicles. Well, that's clearly something that's of value in terms of reducing congestion and reducing accidents and emissions, which I think is a goal of many of these programs. But that's really something that's more done at a state and a federal level, because those are where that work is being done. There are other companies that are looking to be investing in localized infrastructure that will be able to create edge computing at very, very low latency at the edge, so that you're not dealing with trying to do things, these digital twins that I talked about earlier, with long hauls back to data centers. So I think it's really going to be a combination, and we're going to need to have something that feels like a consortium as the technology matures, to be able to provide the right kind of guideposts without overdoing the guideposts. And I think that involves a number of stakeholders.
Quickly, I think it'll have to be both. Just unfortunately, due to economics, there's always going to be have and have-nots, and I think a lot of in order to have like the dream scenario, the first one, it costs money, and you see this right away, everything from infrastructure to school systems. Some communities will have the money to lay out edge computing and infrastructure and 5G, et cetera, and other communities won't. And so I think it's not really going to be a choice, it's just an economic reality.
We have about 10 minutes remaining.
Okay. If any folks have questions, there's a microphone over here. Feel free to come up and ask questions. Let me ask one more question. That is economic disruption. With any sort of new technology, there's always economic disruption. Obviously, beginning of last century, when Detroit was producing cars, buggy manufacturers and horse stables went out of business, but then we saw whole new businesses being created. So kind of what's your vision of the economic disruption that will happen in the near future?
So I think this is one of the more exciting ones, because I think if you look at people spend 15% of their income on a car, and if self-driving cars and especially shared cars become a thing, then you spend 15% of your income on a car that is idle 94% of the time of the day. Like, that's not a great ROI. So if autonomous connected electric shared vehicles can improve not only people's transportation efficiency but our use of those dollars, what happens then to restaurants and theaters and movies, because suddenly people's disposable income explodes. So I think that's where there'll be that kind of a shift of spending.
And let me just quickly build on that, because in shifting from autonomous to electrification, when you think about electric cars and the preponderance of electric cars, like we talk about having an energy problem on the grid today. We don't have an energy problem on the grid today. We have a power problem on the grid today. Energy is power over time. What we have is we have consumption that looks like that, and we have peak power that looks like this. So if I'm able to use my electric vehicle, so the new Silverados are going to come out with a bidirectional charging mechanism that basically is going to allow it to be both a sink and a source of electricity. And if I can get tens of thousands of electric vehicles, that's megawatts of availability. And that 94% of the time, if it's not creating economic value through other forms of transportation, it actually can be helping to stabilize the grid and shift that demand curve to look more like this, so that we aren't investing necessarily in new energy, because we're actually load balancing it using the source and sink of electric vehicles.
Okay, rapid fire, and I see Chuck Meyer at the back of the line there, and I can't say no to Chuck Meyer. So yeah, Cole and then Chuck, and we'll have to close out.
Yeah, thank you. Cole Smead here. So you talked about the future, and I love that question. The future of technology has always been, we make something more efficient, we make it better, we don't use less, we use far more. LED lights would be my example. My question is, there's three people that this could actually serve the best: the too young, the too old, and what I'll call the too drunk, or people that don't want to drive in that city because they don't know it, okay? That future would argue that we're going to do total miles on the road that are bigger than today, because like my kids taking a Waymo to the mall are miles that weren't driven by mom and dad because I might have been lazy, and they now go for a fee. How do you guys think about more miles versus a less mile world like some are painting?
I think I would think about more efficient miles, where there are these more efficient miles or versus wasted miles. I mean, your kid now may be able to do this in Waymo by itself, but previously maybe your wife was driving him or someone else was driving him. That's true. That's true. But I think the bigger issue that I see in the transportation problem is that empty mile, wasted mile problem. And I think this is not necessarily with generative AI, but with ML and AI in general, solving that efficiency problem. Right? When we started Convoy, we did in this analysis that 30% of the miles driven by a truck is empty. And if you just move that needle a little bit to 20%, that is a lot of trees, being planted and a lot of carbon emissions being saved. So I think that, to me, is the bigger question that I hope this technology can help solve.
Okay, Chuck Meyer, you get the last question.
A couple of questions, actually. First, what do you expect in the terms of how much data you will need for an average city? How many terabytes of data, et cetera? And the second part is, will there be a common program by which these driverless cars are driven? In other words, if I have a Chevy in, say, Phoenix, and I drive to a town where there's a Tesla program, will I be able to still use my driverless vehicle in this other city?
So I'm going to answer the second one first because I remember it and I forgot the first one second, so I'll do that second. It's really dependent upon the mapped area, right? So for us, we are mapping the entirety of the U.S. So the intent is to be able to really drive it anywhere. So you can literally drive from New York to San Francisco if you wanted to. And so it's not dependent on the technology necessarily in the vehicle. Your Chevy would still have a different drivetrain than the Tesla does, and it still operates on the road effectively in the same way. The issue is what sort of ancillary services are going to facilitate that in the future along the way. So some of the connected kinds of discussions that Mark had, and those things will need to be of a standard so that they can be consumed by everybody. Your first question was on data. I'll tell you that we already have 6 petabytes of training data that we are using, and that number is only going to get bigger. I don't know how big it's going to get.
So I'll answer that question. We have 50 petabytes.
I was just talking the training data, not the connected data.
The answer, Chuck, is there's never enough data. The more data, the better, because it allows you to do whole new things and get more and more accurate. So more data is always better. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's thank our panel.